Well, a very good morning to you. It's great to have this opportunity of sharing with you this morning. Hello to you online. I've been following the service online myself. I see there's been a few images of me at the bottom of some of the words to songs, so it's been good to be involved in that way as well. So sad not to be with you in person. My eldest son has had a flare-up of an autoimmune disease that he contracted last February. So the first month of the pandemic for us, we were in and out of hospital with him. He got much better, thankfully, but there was a flare up again, and he woke up yesterday with a sore throat. And having been in touch with the doctor, she thought it was best that we all self-isolate and take a COVID test. So not wanting to inflict anything on anyone at Chiltern, it felt best to do this by Zoom. So sad not to be with you, but delighted to be sharing with you. And the topic this morning is sharing your faith during a pandemic. And so in some strange way, of course, that illustrates very much the sort of challenges that we've been facing. I was hoping to be able to share my screen. I don't know, it's been disabled apparently. I don't know if that's possible to enable to happen, Chris. If not to worry. But I was hoping to share my screen to show you a PowerPoint as we get going. No? Okay. If that happens, then perhaps someone can let me know. But I don't know how you have found sharing your faith during the pandemic. At one level, issues of life and death have been very much at the forefront, which has turned, of course, some people to do Google searches on prayer. And indeed, online interest in church services seems to be high. The Church of England have reported some 3.7 million being able to have logged on to services. And so it's been great to be able to see that. So I'm just share my screen if I can. Right. Yeah, it's not going to where I was hoping it would go, so not to worry. Maybe I'll share. My apologies for the moment. We'll just get there. Here we are. Here's the PowerPoint, and we'll start from the beginning. Here we are. So, so sharing your faith in a pandemic. There we go. It's nice and slick after all. So you may be that you've faced this situation yourself of being a little nervous about sharing your faith because of the kind of questions. So where is God during the pandemic? Why is God allowing this virus to run rampant around the world? And so for some, there's been a reluctance to share faith because of a failure to answer that kind of question. So on the one hand, there's interest in faith, people interest in prayer, interest in services. On the other hand, the Christians perhaps have been a little bit nervous about knowing what to say. And I have to say that for some Christians, sharing faith and witness, whether there's a pandemic or not, is a bit like flossing your teeth. You know you should get to it, and you know it's valuable, but you never seem to get round to doing it for various reasons. So I'm hopeful this morning to be able to give you some pointers, and especially for those of you who don't have the gift of the gab and are perhaps already guilty and feeling slightly uneasy about looking at this topic at all this morning. So what I want to do is look at three aspects of sharing our faith. And as it were, there's three stories to be aware of. God's story, their story, and indeed your story. So by God's story, I mean the message of the good news of Jesus as revealed in the Bible. In any evangelism training, getting your message right is regarded as the key thing. What is the good news that you have for someone during a pandemic or indeed during any time at all? But also you need to think about their story. And this is perhaps the area that's often forgotten because they are listening to what you're saying and filtering everything that you say through their own experience of Christianity or non-experience of Christianity. They may not even understand the language that you use. So their story is key. And then, and of course, there's your story, your own testimony, your own journey of coming to faith, and your own journey with God today. And so in any given situation, in any given conversation, you will find that the kind of conversation you have will hinge on the importance of these three stories. If you're talking with a complete stranger, then of course you will need to ask questions about their story before you know what's appropriate to share at all. And it will be different if someone has been brought up in a Christian home and rejected that message, that rejected the message they've heard. That will be a very different conversation to someone who's been brought up in an atheist home and who knows very little. And that's very different, of course, from someone who has a faith or a religion of their own, which is distinct or different from Christianity. And until you know what elements to share, what elements of their faith or their understanding, then you won't know what elements to share at all. So here's this is a picture of we're going to be looking particularly at Acts 17 this morning. Thank you for the person who read that earlier in the service. This is you can go there today. I've been there. This is Mars Hill, not far from the Areopagus, still scaffolding there on the top of the hill. But at the forefront is Mars Hill, where Paul himself was believed to have delivered this message. And so, as I say, we're going to look at their story, your story, and God's story in slightly different order. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and go back to you. There we go. Okay, so the first task of communication, especially one-to-one, is what do they know or think already prior to you saying something? And it's here that we see the genius of the Apostle Paul in this passage in Acts 17. For he's been left there in Athens. He's kind of on a journey. He's distressed by the elders. He's already chatted to some of the locals. Some have been interested in what Paul has had to say. And he's had this opportunity to address the Areopagus, the leaders of the nation of Athens, and to communicate something of what he had of his own message that he'd been sharing in conversation already. And you'll discover that if you look through the book of Acts at all the different sermons that take place there, you'll discover that each of them is slightly different depending on the audience. So if Paul is talking to an audience that has a Jewish background who know the Old Testament, then Paul himself will quote that Old Testament because it has meaning for them. But if the Apostle Paul, as he is now, is addressing people with a non-religious background or a non-Jewish background, they have a religious background, but they're not Jewish, then he starts in a completely different fashion. And so here in Acts 17, and if you have a Bible handy, you might want to follow along with me, second half of the chapter, as Paul's addressing the people in the Areopagus. We know from Greek history some background that gives you some understanding as to why Paul speaks as he does. In the 6th century BC, there was a plague in Athens which was killing many people. It got so alarming that Nicias, one of the leaders of Athens, went to an island where there was a guy there known as the Oracle to find out if he had any insight into why there should be this plague. And the guy said, well, it's pretty clear that you have angered a god, and that's why this plague has come. And so he sent them back to, so he comes back to Athens and tells the leaders there. And he said, the oracle told me that I should go to meet Epimenides, who's a bit of a sage, and bring him to Athens. And so this is what he does. And Epimenides is brought to give the answer as to how they could deal with this plague. And Epimenides comments on the many idols that he could see in the city of Athens. Never have I seen so many idols to so many gods. He says, you've clearly angered and upset one of them. And they say, yeah, we know that, but which one? And the guy said, well, what I suggest we do is you get a flock of sheep and you bring them to the hill and you ask the god that you've angered to direct these sheep to the altar to him. And then you sacrifice to that god. You sacrifice the sheep to that god. And they say, well, okay, we just as well try that. So they brought the sheep to the hill, but being sheep, perhaps they end up going not to any of the idols, but going to just part of the hillside where there's no idols at all. And so they swallow hard and they think, well, maybe we've angered a God that we don't know about. And so they sacrifice to an unknown God. And what do you know? But within a week or so, the plague ends. And so they erect an altar to an unknown God. And for a while, there's garlands and flowers given and put to this God, so-called. And then, of course, as time goes on, it just becomes one of a number of idols on the hillside. And so chances are the Apostle Paul knew this background when he arrives. And so in his message, he talks to them, the people of Athens, he says, I see that in every way you are very religious. As I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Now, I need to add very carefully that there's no suggestion in Paul's message that he believes that the God brought the plague to Athens in some way. And that's, I think, one of the issues that we sometimes have, is that we assume that God must have brought the pandemic. Well, there's no suggestion. There are times in Scripture, of course, when God brings plagues, but there's no suggestion that everything that's awful and horrible comes from the hand of God. And that's certainly not something I'd want to suggest, and certainly not something that Paul suggests in his message. What he does is he uses this as a point from which to pitch his understanding about God. So he says that he's the God who made the world and everything in it. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in temples made by human hands as if he needs anything, but he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. So Paul starts with creation, starts with the fact that all of these people in Athens are created by this God. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that God has placed them in Athens that they might reach after him and perhaps find in verse 27, though he is not far from any one of us. And then Paul says in verse 28, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. So Paul is starting from where they are. He's even quoting their own literature. And then he's presenting his message regarding Jesus. And then he talks about verse 31. He mentions Jesus finally, verse 31. For he has set a day when he would judge the world with justice by the man he appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by rising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, as they did last Easter Sunday. Some people sneer at the idea of Jesus risen. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. We don't know when exactly, whether it was directly after the message or later on, but some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Now, some have suggested that Paul's approach in Athens was too cerebral and intellectual, and that's why there was relatively little fruit. Well, I would say this is fantastic fruit. To people without a Jewish background, without understanding the fact the Apostle Paul could engage with them, excuse me, and see a number of folk coming to faith, I think was terrific, and a mark of the fact that on this occasion, Paul's approach was thoroughly appropriate for the audience that he was addressing. So it would seem to me there is no formula at one level in sharing your faith at any time, particularly during a pandemic. Clearly, God needs to be at work, quickening people's hearts. We do the best job that we can do in sharing our faith as timidly and as nervously as sometimes we come across. And the person themselves needs to be at that place for response. We may be sowing seeds, we may be reaping. There's these three elements. There's no, it's in a sense is a divine mystery, but in another sense it's wonderful to be involved, because your conversation with someone could be that key point which helps them to come to faith in Jesus themselves. So there is no formula. If you look at the life of Jesus, the conversations he has, he treated different folk in different places in different ways. And he would always respond to where they were at, their story, what they were bringing to him, whether that was a particular need for healing, a question that they had, or a concern from what had happened in his life. And so when we talk in terms of their story, we need to be asking questions about where they're coming from when we come to them. For some in the UK, particularly, of course, most will have had some kind of religious education, so they won't be completely ignorant. But often it's a misunderstood faith. They believe that Christianity is about being nice and loving your neighbor and keeping as many of the 10 commandments as you can manage. And with respect to the pandemic, some will be curious to know what you believe as a Bible believer about the pandemic and whether God is to blame. But many won't have that as a frame of reference at all. It won't be in their mindset at all. And let's be clear that this pandemic has been one of many through human history. And so Christians down through the centuries have had to face the fact that there have been plagues, and they've sought to care for those in need at the time. They've sought to look to God in prayer. They've sought to pray for healing, and they've trusted God that God will intervene as and when he sees fit, as he has done indeed during this pandemic. Some Christians, of course, assume that everything that is sent in life comes from God. Others would say, well, yes, God allows all things, but he's created a world where human beings have their own freedom and free will. And as soon as in the book of Genesis, humanity turned their back on God, things go pear-shaped. Sin enters the world, and viruses and plagues and illness is all part of the sadness of that. And God is wonderfully at work in our world, in the miraculous sometimes, but certainly one day bringing all things to completion in Christ, whether be no sin and pain and dying and illness at all. And until that day, we continue to look to him and trust him and be confident in him and his loving care for each one of us. And so if you're nervous about the whole process of sharing your faith, particularly during a pandemic, just learn to ask curious questions of the people that you're chatting with, finding out their story. And then God will guide you as you discover where they're at, as to what you should maybe share, or other questions you should ask, or how you can be praying for them as a result. Your job is not to ask, how can I ram my message down their throats? But what is the most loving thing for me to say that can move the person forward? If there's illness or discomfort, you can offer to pray. If there's ignorance of faith, you can invite them to church or invite them to read something. If there is interest, then you can say, I've got a Christian faith. I'd love to tell you more if you're interested. Hopefully you come across not weird or Bible bashing, but as naturally as possible, as you would share any piece of news or any interest in any other topic at all. So that's their story. But then secondly, we need to look at our story, your story, sharing your own testimony. In other places in the book of Acts, of course, the Apostle Paul shares his story, and it's probable, I guess, in Athens, we don't hear the whole list of the interactions that Paul has with the Athenians. Probably at some point he shared his own story too. And in your life, if you have particularly a dramatic testimony story, of course you might want to share that at some point, but it may or may not be massively relevant and important. But it's good to be able to learn how to share your testimony of coming to faith in Jesus. And if this was an evangelism training session, I would invite you to turn to the person next to you and spend 90 seconds sharing your journey with them, and get them to do the same back. But you'll be glad I won't be doing that this morning for obvious reasons. But, if I was sharing my story just in 90 seconds, I would say that I was brought up in a Christian home on the Isle of Wight. You see the scene behind me is of the Needles on the corner, some miles from where I was brought up on the Isle of Wight. So I was brought up to attend church every Sunday, sometimes 3 times on a Sunday. And it was a kind of church that stressed the importance of personal faith in Jesus. So when I was around 7 years of age, I was very aware that I preferred a destiny with God in heaven than absent with God in hell. So I asked that Jesus's death on the cross would count for me. And so I became a Christian. And as I grew up and understood more and matured as a person and as a believer, around the age of 13, I said I wanted to be baptized publicly to declare my allegiance to Jesus. And when friends later on who'd been with me growing up through the faith became skeptical and drifted away, there was no way I was going to do that, because the God that I knew answered my prayer, even the trivial prayers of me as I was learning and being educated at school. So there was no way that I was going to turn my back on that God. And many decades later, I still have a living relationship with Jesus. So I didn't time that, but that was certainly less, I would guess, than 90 seconds. Just something succinct that shares your message. And if you're not used to doing that, you might want to just write it down and try it out on a friend or family member and say, look, this is how I came to faith. So do so without any jargon, just sharing a little bit about the before faith, perhaps how you came to faith and how life has been since. And so that's your story. And you will tailor your story to your understanding of their story and what is going to be particularly relevant and valuable to them. And so we finally come to God's story. So what is the message, the good news that we share? And here again, I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. Back to where we were. So we've looked at their story, your story, and God's story. And next we come to, if my PowerPoint will work, and it seems to be stuck. Isn't it always the way? Stop share. Okay, so I won't do the screen share, but I will talk about the good news of the gospel as we need to share it, God's story. So first of all, I would start with God as creator, because there's no meaning for God's involvement in our lives if he hasn't created all things. No, don't get hung up on the science of it all, and the evolution and creation and all those debates, unless you're a scientist can go into it. But just say that however it happened, whatever means God used, God has set the whole thing in motion and created human beings in his image to share something of who he is and to share his love and goodness with the world that he had made. And as such, you can say that God as creator loves you and cares for you and hates the sin and disease and death that has come into our world. But evil indeed has come into our world in the person of Satan. And so back in the beginning, of course, we discover how Satan tempts Adam and Eve not to believe the good word of God, that God has their best interests at heart, and tempting them to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So sin and evil enters our world, and Adam and Eve break their relationship with God. They were told that if they break their relationship with God, then they will die, and that indeed is what happens. And both Adam and Eve have a fixed life on earth and eventually go down to the dust from which they came. This is a result of being estranged from God. God intended that all should be good, but sin enters the world. And we as human beings often go against God. We are willful in our choice of going our own way. But God is not going to leave humanity that way. He has a rescue plan. He began in Abraham and later the nation of Israel, descendants of Abraham. And that's sometimes left out from gospel presentations. But the whole of the Old Testament is is God's reconciling work with humanity, which starts in Abraham and through the people of Israel, demonstrates, who are aiming to demonstrate the good news of God and what it's like to be related with this God. But sadly, that community fails in its ability to share what God is like with the nations around, and they become idolatrous themselves. They worship themselves and their own pleasure, and so God has to exile them from the land and the community that the God had provided for them. And although they eventually come back to the land at the end of the Old Testament, things are still not right. And through the prophets, God is hinting that he himself was going to come one day and renew the people of God and renew the community and give a new power and ability to know him. And sure enough, when Jesus comes, God become flesh. So we have in the life of Jesus, God coming close to humanity, God in our neighborhood. And through his life, death, and resurrection, we discover something of who God is. That through his life, that this is a God who loves people, who cares for people, who's involved in people's life, who wants them to know God as he truly is. And Jesus obviously comes in his death to restore humanity back to himself. In his death on the cross, he enables his Father to punish sin, the sin that separates us from him in his own body, and proof positive that death was accepted is that he rises victoriously from the dead on the third day, which we celebrate, of course, last Easter Sunday, and now has returned to heaven one day to return to this world. And in the meantime, he's gathering a community of people who will acknowledge that Jesus is the true Lord of this world and can provide life in all its fullness. Life in this world by his Spirit, as we get to know him for ourselves, and life in the world to come as one day the new heavens and new earth will be brought into being. So those are some of the simple things that I would have shared. I'd have just put them on a PowerPoint if I'd have been able to share that PowerPoint with you. Just some of the basics: God as creator, the fact that there was a fall, the fact that Israel was God's community to demonstrate his love with the world, the failure of that community, the coming of Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection, that the church is designed that we may know and love him and grow in our understanding of him. And then the future, which for those who know and love Jesus will be glorious. And sadly, the judgment for those who choose instead to follow their own way and go away from God and his purposes. And so those are the three stories. There's their story. You need to know where folk are coming from in order to know what to share. There's your story, your own testimony of coming to faith. And then there's God's story, the actual message. And you will, I've given you a brief summary there, but you will tailor which parts of that message to share with someone. If they know very little about God, then you'll be sharing very little. You'll just be opening them up to the idea that maybe there's a God who loves them and who cares for them. Maybe you share a little about the life of Jesus. So there's no formula that I can give. There's a number of very simple outlines of the Christian faith that you can go to, the bridge illustration and 2 ways to live and other types. But I would urge you just to share in your own words something of your own understanding of God's story, and not say too much, and invite curiosity from them so that as they ask you, you'll discover the kind of things that are important. Now, if I was listening to a talk like this, I would probably be feeling slightly uneasy and slightly guilty at this point and thinking, oh boy, I'm going to have to feel guilty about how little I share my faith. And I really don't want that to be the outcome of this message this morning. That's really not my intention. It should be a joy and a delight to be able to share the good news of Jesus with others. And if that's not the case, then it's something for you to be talking to God about. But the question I want you to leave with you, and I want you to be asking, is how can I assist the person in front of me to know God better? How can I assist them to know God better? And God, will you give me an opportunity this week to serve you in this way? So ask that question of yourself and be open to that. And obviously, in some cases, you'll be mixing with people who know about you, know your faith, and perhaps you can say relatively little. But in other cases, you'll be bumping into people, you've no idea where they're at with their walk with God. And you could say, look, I've just been curious sometime to talk about something that's important in my life, and that's my Christian faith, and wonder where you come to when you're in your understanding of that. So please don't be guilty, but please ask God that question, for God to give you an opportunity, and to ask that question of yourself: how can I assist this person to know God better? So my thanks again for this opportunity this morning to share with you, whether you're in church this morning or listening online. May God give you those opportunities in the week ahead. Thank you very much.